This is entertaining, because I know nothing about acoustics. I'm a confession, for I come from the world of light. I've spent most of my life either as a laser engineer, a fiber optic engineer, and yes, I'm aware distributed fiber optic sensors that do acoustics are an interesting thing. In fact, I have a project working on those. But I've spent most of my life working in light, and for the last decade, maybe a dozen years, I've worked in the murky world of business development, helping companies, universities, investors, governments, and even continents try and work out what the opportunity is around enabling technology and what the impact is. And whenever you work with those people, it doesn't matter whether it's a small company or an investor or even a national institution, you rapidly work out there's only one question that comes to mind when they first ask you what the opportunity is, and that's how big it is. Right? Everybody wants to quantify. So the first question is, how big is your industry? How big is your impact? What's your contribution? That's fine if you're working, shall I make this new widget? How many can I sell? It becomes a much more taxing question when you're talking about a whole sector. What's your impact on the economy? How many jobs does your industry generate, create, secure? That's a much harder job. So we tackled this inside the photonics industry a few years ago when I was posed this question. First, within Europe, what's the impact of photonics on the European economy? It's huge. What's the impact in some regional economies around the UK? So we developed a methodology to try and solve this problem. And that methodology is now used in the UK, in many regions in the UK, around Europe, in many countries around the world, and is also the global standard for how we measure the impact and size of the photonics industry. And in the UK, last year, that generated this magic report, the UK Photonics, the Hidden Economy, Hidden Economic Engine. And as I produced this, some people got around to reading it, and Kirill and Richard, in a rather an interesting and diverse process, got hold of a copy and said to me, fascinating. Could you do the same for acoustics? And I went, well, I don't know anything about acoustics. Not sure I can. And then I thought about it. I thought, actually, there's an awful lot in common between acoustics and photonics. Not necessarily, well, there is even technically, and you get into the physics. But actually, when you look at the businesses and how they work and how the technology impacts other things, I thought, actually, yes, there's no reason I can't apply this methodology to acoustics. So that's essentially what we've done. This report, which you have a copy of, this one, which looks rather similar to the other one, strangely, does exactly that. It applies the same tried and tested methodology to trying to size the UK acoustics industry and its direct contribution to the economy. And I'm going to talk a little about the results of that, the findings that are in this, and some of the background and context. So, why, right? Why is this important? I have a hard time reading this because my glasses don't work at this level. I have to read this one. So, first, there's a common cause. Photonics and acoustics are both enabling technologies, often embedded into much bigger systems. They're a key part of many things, but rarely are they a product in their own right, although, just as there are lights in this room and speakers and microphones, there are examples of when they're products in their own right. But as you look at cameras, which are a lens system and a focal plane array, they're part of a bigger system, and often the acoustics, similarly, part of a bigger system. So they're embedded in things, part of a bigger picture. Yet often, they're a critical part of that picture. If you make a system that is too noisy or not noisy enough, it will fail. If you build a building and it has the wrong acoustics, as we were just learning about from opera houses, if it doesn't sound right, it doesn't fulfill its function. So it's a critical part. But what we notice is that every product in the world has both a visual and a sound property, sound signature. Of course it does. You can see it, you can hear it, or even if you can't hear it or see it, it has a property. And that gives us a challenge, because enabling technologies as these are everywhere. Acoustics is ubiquitous, light is ubiquitous. But that very ubiquitous nature breeds a familiarity and assumption of commonality that means people take them for granted. They become taken for granted technologies. And so the challenge of all enabling technologies is to break that taken for granted assumption and try and make them stand out from the vertical markets they serve, whether it's construction or automotive or aerospace, and to quantify their impact rather than being purely absorbed into those end markets, to be appreciated for the value they add and therefore supported for the value they add. So this is in part what this is about doing. This is to make sure people know how valuable acoustics is to the UK economy. So I've spent a long time fighting the cause of enabling technologies. I'm chief executive of the National Photonics Leadership Group that nudges policy and process together. And so it's very nice to be able to pass some of those tips on to another enabling technology. Why? Why is this important? Well, in November 2017, after a year of consultation, our magic government published this thing, the UK's industrial strategy. Lovely glossy document. Government likes to produce these now and again. But the reason it's important is that this defines where government will spend their money for the foreseeable future. It sets a grand aim of increasing UK research and development to 2.4% of GDP. Many of you will have heard of that number. Some people forget is that 2.4% is not government spend. That 2.4% is industry spend and government spend together. And what they're very keen to do is to make sure that money they put in leverages more industry spend. And that's very important because they need to understand the industry is going to leverage from. And so if you don't understand that, you can't lever from nothing. So they're going to put in an extra 4.7 billion into R&D. That's a lot of money, but they're expecting industry to put in even more, so you have to leverage from something. The other thing the industrial strategy does, it defines the grand challenges that we should be addressing. And they're an interesting mix. Aging society, clean growth, future of mobility, these make sense, but you put artificial intelligence and data in there, that's actually, I don't have a challenge with artificial intelligence and data. Isn't that an opportunity that delivers solutions to the other things? But we are not to argue why they do these. It also defines the foci, the things that they want us to work on. Ideas, innovation, people, training, infrastructure, networks, business environment, tax, places. I'll come back to places, but they regard that as extremely important. And you've heard in the news today issues about equality, about distribution of places. It also defines the mechanism by which they're going to spend that magic 4 billion, and that's mostly through this new thing called the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And we need to pay very, very careful attention to that. But the key thing I want you to, if there's one thing you take away from what I say, it's how are you impacting those grand challenges? And that's really important because they are the grand challenges, we can't change them. But if government goes onto your website and they don't see the link between what you do and those grand challenges, they will ask the question about why are you relevant? So it is beholden on any enabling technology community to make a very clear link. We're doing this because this will help clean growth. We're doing this because it will help the future of mobility. We have this impact because it will help health and the aging of society. Those things are important because, yes, there are lots of officials inside BEIS who flick through websites and very quickly work out whether the community is in support of that industrial strategy or whether they've ignored it. Do not ignore it. So, Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. That's where all the money is going to be spent, and they've defined lots of these areas already. They had 2 calls where they defined them themselves, then they put out an open call last year, and there are lots of these. You'll see most are in vertical markets, a couple of exceptions, but the future of construction, transforming construction, driverless cars, creative industries clusters. I'm not quite sure what that really means. But in all cases, what they're looking for is to spend X to impact Y in 2 years. Right? So we spent X, we're going to impact construction in 2 years. What you'll see is no mention of acoustics, no mention of photonics, very little mention of any enabling technologies, with the exception of batteries and electric motors. And that's very simply why, because the motor guys can say, how many combustion engines do we make in the UK? 8,000 people are employed making combustion engines in the UK. They will all be unemployed if we transfer to electric motors. So the downside is very real in that industry, so that gains government attention. So if we don't have, and it's very, very hard to get any enabling technology onto that list, you have to think about how do we work with that? How can we deliver impact into those bits of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund with that being defined? And key is evidence, right? Support from government, support from these needs us to say how big the industry is, how productive it is, how many people it employs, where, and who, and when. Right? And those are critical because unless you're doing that, government has no idea of the impact. If it spends X, where's the impact going to be, and when? And so enabling technologies in particular need to focus on what their evidence is of impact. So that's what this is all about, trying to work out what your impact is. And impact here, I mean direct economic impact. I'll come back to leveraged impact, which is the impact that you have on your customers, right? So how much, say, automotive may gain from doing good acoustics. That's secondary impact, or leverage, as it's often known. First concern is how many people do you employ. So I'm not going to keep hanging around in suspense. That's the answer, right? 16,000 people, approximately, 750 companies, 4.6 billion pounds worth of output, and something called GVA, and I'll come back to what that is, of 65,000 pounds per head. So, useful and interesting numbers. I'll describe a little about how they compare, but also how we got to those numbers. But the first point to note is it's not trivial to get those. You can't go to the Office of National Statistics, put in a standard industrial code for acoustics and say how big the industry is. Pharmaceuticals can do that. Construction can do that. You can't, right? Enabling tech cannot do that. So you have to find a methodology that works with that. You have to work with the fact that many companies operate in vertical markets and will more closely associate themselves with their vertical market than, say, with acoustics. And acoustics is often not everything people do. How many people in this room would consider themselves purely an acoustics company, doing nothing else other than acoustics? Almost nobody, right? So it's a rare thing. And that's true of enabling technologies because you have to integrate yourself with other systems, so you have to bring in other expertise. So that means you have to cope with diversified companies and the fact that you have a hidden technology, which means most of the companies are hidden. So you need a methodology. That's what we worked on. It doesn't overestimate, doesn't underestimate. There was a report on the electronic systems industry done in the UK where they said anybody with electronics of any sort was the electronics industry. So they accounted the entire revenue of BAE Systems. I believe that's cheating. So you have to be careful. So here's the process we went through. First thing you must is find a boundary conditions, right? You guys are as familiar with these as any other guys. And that's companies involved in the generation, manipulation, control, transmission, and detection of sound and vibration. That's the definition we came up with, as general as you can be. No constraints on frequency, no technical language in there. It doesn't define whether it's air, water, solid. All of those are inclusive, right? It includes services, design, as well as hardware. And you've heard several talks today about the value of the design piece in acoustics, not just the hardware that makes it work. As this is the direct contribution to the economy, it excludes publicly funded bodies. That will be double counting. This is how much money you add to the economy, not how much money you take away from it. And you also exclude, actually good examples of this, public address systems. These are made in Germany, by the way, and such forth. Because those, and yes, an acoustics guitar is an acoustic instrument, but it's an instrument first. So you have to exclude those, otherwise you end up including the entire music industry in what you count for. And then the process works like this. You start with a list that came from the Acoustics Network, and said, right, does that have everybody we need in it? No. But what you do is you add to that list by looking for the common names in it, and then searching the entire UK database of companies, which sits on my laptop on the floor, 4.3 million companies, and goes, are there any others that use similar terms and associate themselves with similar industrial sectors? That gives you a long list. And then you farm it out to a great team of volunteers who start to filter out all the rubbish. Sound financial planning is not part of the acoustics industry, no matter what we might like to think. So you get rid of the rubbish and you end up with a master candidate list of companies. Then what you need to do is to say, oh, how valuable are they? And to that point, I don't try and generate the financial numbers. It's very important to go to somebody independent. We go to Dun & Bradstreet, who are a credit agency, actually, and ask them to give you the numbers on how much the company's turnover, how many people they employ, and what their profit is. And that, for a small fee, that number is available. They draw those numbers from companies' house returns, where every company has to return, but they have a couple of tricks. And I'll go into those in a second. But then what do you do? That gives you big numbers, but then what do you do with the companies that are diversified, that produce more than just acoustics? And that's where the big challenge comes in. So, and this is the key step that we've innovated in. I find this amazing that it's innovation. I'm an engineer at heart, but economics innovation is a little easier. Is to say to a panel of experts, what fraction of the output of these companies should we consider to be acoustics? Now, I can't do that. I'm not an acoustics expert. So what we did is get a panel of people together, which Kirill and Richard very kindly convened to say, let's look at these people, let's group them together, construction people, automotive people together, so we're trying to be fair to everyone and say what portion of that output should be considered acoustics. And you can do that relatively simply by saying, well, do they have anybody who has acoustic skills internally? If they don't, if they just buy it in, they're an integrator, they're not really adding value. But if they have acoustic designers internally, of course they have some contribution to add, they're adding value. Then it's a question of what percentage. And you don't try and do it to, is it 52% or 51%? It's a pointless argument, right? You do 75, 50, 20, 5, 1. You bucket it quite closely. So you bucket those things together. I don't know how easy it is to read. It's roughly readable. And then you sum the outputs. But then you have a little challenge, because gross value add is used as a measure of productivity. And this is, for those who aren't familiar, is the contribution made by a company to the economy directly. And it is essentially made up of profit before tax and the wage bill. Right? So if you think about it, as a company, the wages you pay go to your employees and they spend them in the economy, right? Whether it's on food or whether it's on housing. The taxes they pay go into the economy, and the profit they make also goes into the economy in reinvestment terms or even dividends to their shareholders. But all of four of those mechanisms are why a company contributes to the economy. So gross value add is essentially the sum of the wage bill and the profit you make. To do that, though, you need to know what the wage bill is. That's hard. Fortunately, one of the tweaks in accounting rules that mean a great number of large companies now have to, when they file their annual reports to the company's house, they have to say what their total wage bill is and the number of people they employ. So what we did is simply look at those companies' house reports, look for those numbers across the 10 or dozen companies who are purely based in acoustics, divide A by B, and you get an average salary. And that enables you to calculate GVA. But that's a subtle trick that's openly available and actually gives you a very consistent number. So when you do that, you have these key steps. Use independent financial numbers, and that's really important for the legitimacy of the numbers. You don't generate it, you don't call people up. If somebody needs to go and check it, they go and check the company's house return. Job done, right? You take that as employee benefit of the average of the top companies declaring. And of course, the smart people will realize if I've taken the total wage bill divided by the total number of employees, that includes the wages of the CEO and the apprentice. So it's generally averaged entirely through the company. To add those up. And then you do this apportionment, right? So you only include the fraction of a company's output that could be considered acoustics by an expert, okay? And interestingly, that word cloud in the middle is what happens when you look at the most commonly occurring words in all the companies that made it into the final analysis. So from that, if you wish to differentiate yourselves, pick a word that's not on there. If you wish to fit into the norm, acoustics is the biggest word you should use. So, an entertaining way of looking at it. Okay. So what we ended up with, as I said, these numbers, 4.6, £1 billion gross value add to the economy, so that's the total before you divide it by the 16,000 people employed. That 65k GVA per employee, that's a core measure of productivity because that's how much the industry outputs. Please never confuse it with output per head of population, which is often published for a region in the UK, and it bears no measure to productivity at all. In fact, the Office of National Statistics have a big banner that says, please do not use GVA figures per head of population as a measure of productivity. It has nothing to do with productivity at all, because not everybody in the region works. Right? So, and the other thing to remember, these are economic estimates only. We had a list of 750 companies. We only got data of 605, right? Because data isn't available on everybody. And please don't get hung up on millions. If you have a result that's 4.6 billion, plus or minus 1 million, is not even a percentage point, right? And often people come up to me and say, oh, you've forgotten this company. 20% of what they do is acoustics, and they turn over 10 million pounds. So what? Doesn't make any difference to total numbers, right? They really are quite immune to that. Similarly, you put that one in at 50% and it should be 20%. Doesn't actually statistically make much difference to the numbers. They're quite robust against those type of variants because you're averaging over a decent number of companies. Okay, so to bear that in mind. But the other thing to bear in mind is beware of the timing. These figures come from Dun & Bradstreet, which come from Companies House. Those of you who file at Companies House know that you file last year's figures about now, so there's at least a year's delay. So most of these are for companies whose annual returns were filed up to December 2017. Okay? We analysed the data in November, so we got the data from the previous year. So this data is already 14 months old. And you can't do anything about that because they won't publish their reports for 2018 until July or August at the very earliest. So there is a timing lag. Okay. How does it compare? How do those numbers compare to other industries? It's quite an important thing to think about. So I know the figures for photonics really well. Okay, that's about 12.9 billion, 1,500 firms, 65,000 people in photonics, and a GVA of 62K. So GVA is quite similar. Pharma, it's really interesting. 53K jobs. They claim a GVA per job of £300,000. Nobody clearly knows why. I'm extremely suspicious of that number. Automotive, their GVA almost identical to acoustics. Actually, and I'll show why that is. Right? But they have 170,000 people, so it's 10 times the size of industry. Okay. Nuclear, 63,000 jobs. Steel, 34,000 jobs. You're beginning to get into the same order of magnitude. But these are industries I picked specifically because you hear them as being supported a lot. So it's important to know how you compare to them. Okay. Relative to the whole economy, 4.6 billion is about 2% of all UK engineering output, to put it in context. The acoustics employment numbers, that's 16,000, and the GVA at a billion is about 0.6% of all of manufacturing output and employment, and about 1.5% of engineering. Okay. So it's not a huge amount of engineering or manufacturing output, but it's still significant. That GVA per employee, or productivity figure, is almost exactly what the overall manufacturing productivity is. Of course, that's why the GVA and employment figure is about the same. Okay. And that's significantly higher than the UK average productivity of only 57k per job. Okay. The minimum wage, the average wage we use, £46,000, that works out when you take those numbers from Companies House and do the division, is much higher than the average UK manufacturing wage, but be careful. Remember I said I took all employees, managing director to cleaner, and divided them by the total wage bill. That is only the people who work in manufacturing. Right? So, and that skew heavily upwards very quickly if you think about what the distribution of earnings looks like in a company. But it is still significantly higher than the whole economy's average wage, but just be cautious of those figures. Okay? It's not an apples for apples comparison before you start saying that acoustics people earn 3 times the national average. Where are those companies located? Where is that employment? Well, there's a heat map of where all those people are located. It's a cautionary tone. One thing to note, though, 1,200 people up in the north, 1.2 billion and 4,000 people up in the northwest. Remember, it's not quite as obvious as it was under George Osborne, but there is still an emphasis on Northern Powerhouse and place in the industrial strategy. What they really mean by place is employment and GVA generation outside the southeast. That's really what they're interested in. And this is really strong because it shows your strongest region is not down here, it's up there. Right? And that's something to really take home. It's actually probably even more up here than this figure makes out because this is based mostly on the HQ of companies. Where are they registered address? Because that's what you get from Companies House. A lot of companies, especially bigger ones, will report their annual earnings to a small little office in Westminster, down here, where their manufacturing location is out here, right? That doesn't appear, unfortunately, in these statistics. I'm busy fixing that in photonics, and it is one of the most laborious processes you can imagine. So I don't recommend it to anyone. But it's important that that is an initial indication of location. It's not everything. Ignore the southeast bias. But the very fact that you managed to get a northwest locus, even given that qualifier, is incredible. The size of those companies. So 98% of all acoustics operations we look at are small and medium-sized enterprises. I should caution what I mean by an operation. That's either a fully dedicated acoustics company or the acoustics portion of a larger company. So I'm not, if you take a larger company that does somebody like Dyson, big company, but they do some acoustics, it's the acoustics guesstimate of Dyson, not the big picture that we're talking about. And they're all SMEs. Actually, they're not even SMEs. 75% of them are micro companies, micro organizations, a huge number of micro companies. 78% turnover less than $1 million. So there's this really long tail. There's a big peak, and there's a really long tail. A lot of people get really concerned about that. Don't worry, you're not unusual. This compares that, acoustics, to UK engineering and indeed UK manufacturing. And you'll see that distribution of micro, small and medium is actually identical across the whole of manufacturing and the whole of engineering. It's not unusual at all. It's absolutely standard. Don't need to be paranoid at all. Actually, one of the most curious things is that the proportion of large companies, 2%, is statistically significantly double what it is in UK manufacturing or UK engineering. You'll have more large companies than most other people, not less. That's actually very significant. So don't worry about the big blue bit, worry about the small purple bit on the top left, right? So that's an important takeaway. But where does the value come from? So this is fascinating. If you look where the money is generated, the grey bars are the same distribution of company sizes, but the blue is where the money comes from. So this is the total revenue that comes from different company sizes. And you'll see that, well, 90% of revenue and 80% of employment comes from large and medium companies. There aren't many of them, but they generate the cash. And this is a really important message for those unfamiliar with the macroeconomics. This says it's the large firms that dominate value generation. Small and micro firms do not generate significant value. There may be hundreds of them, but it doesn't compensate for the output of the big ones. Right? It's not unusual. In photonics, it's almost exactly the same. Less than 3% of global revenues in photonics comes from the small companies. It's tiny. Right? So large companies are also more productive. I'll say 90% of the revenue, only 80% of the people, so they've got to be more productive. That's common because they share back office costs. It's a common macroeconomic analysis. But this is really important because this is why government gets hung up on how do you translate small companies into large companies, because they're aware the value comes from large companies, right? So that's why they're hung up on that. It also means when you choose your partners, think about who you're choosing and why. Small companies are the technology expertise feed into the economy, but not the economic engine. They are perhaps should be considered the gearbox rather than the engine, right? And that's worth thinking about. You don't get anywhere without saying you have a knowledge base. So we've said there's a big industry, there's a useful industry, impacts things, but you need a strong knowledge base. That's one of the intervention criteria from government. So Kirill very kindly did this. This is an analysis of the total number of UK research grants in acoustics over 5 different research areas over a 4-year period, 5-year period. And what you'll see is there's 120, 140 million pounds worth of active research grants. But what's really interesting, that's spread over 47 different institutes spread around the country. The expertise is not in one place. Remember I said the importance of place in the industrial strategy? That shows you have a distributed knowledge base. Also, when you look at the research councils that money comes from, it's not just engineering and physical sciences, it's medical, it's natural environment, NERC, it's STFC, it's arts and humanities, it's biotech and biological sciences, BBSRC. All of the research councils are funding acoustics. That shows the diversity of the base you have. That is unusual. If you go to the nuclear industry, do you find the same thing? I very much doubt it. Right? So you can also, of course, since you know the value of the grants, you can change that and you can say, where are the large number of grants? So you end up with a slightly different heat map that shows that there are a lot of grants and there are some focuses of expert location, and this is also important because people often ask, okay, you have distribution across the UK, but where are the real centres of excellence? Right, and this helps pick out the centres of excellence that are running the most grants. So, we have a knowledge base, we have an industry. Next key question, how does it underpin the industrial strategy? Okay, we've said acoustics is everywhere. It's central to addressing the grand challenges. You must show how it underpins the industrial strategy challenge fund areas. And this is important. The top bits in orange are these 5 areas government has set. We are not going to change those. They have decided to implement those to put in these industrial strategy challenge fund areas. Every single one of those has £100 million to spend, right? But they have to spend it in a short space of time. Remember at the beginning I said they're going to put X into Y for impact in 2 years. I didn't say the impact in Z years. It's impact in 2 years, a political cycle. How many people here have a product development cycle that is 2 years or less? Wow, 1, right? So they are asking for people to innovate and make impact less than most people's product development cycles. That is a problem, right? And I'll come on to the opportunity and the risk associated with that. But what you have to do is to map where does acoustics underpin these things. It's very hard to get one of these, but it's very easy to go to these guys and say, you need to have impact in 2 years. No worries, we're experts in this stuff. Let us help you deliver your impact by running projects in one of these areas that enable us to do this. And that really helps because what you're doing is you're helping them solve a problem. But they are very busy and they do not understand what UK acoustics capability there is. They don't even know who to ask. So you can't sit here and assume these people will come to you. You have to go to them and say, we understand you're running an ISCF in the energy revolution. Let us come and help you as acoustics professionals deliver on that. We think you will have this challenge. Let us come and fix it. So you have to go to them proactively, not passively. Okay. Is there a global market? Well, this is interesting. These are just some headline figures. Sound insulation, 10 billion. Ultrasonics, 7 billion. Voice recognition, 9 billion, but growing like an absolute Trojan, to identify just a few. The important thing is, if you go to Innovate and you say, we'd like some money, they'll say, is there a global market that's worth a few billion? Well, lots of global markets worth a few billion. No problem for acoustics, except there's not an acoustics market that's identified as 50 billion that adds them all up. There's lots of separate vertical markets. So the challenge is, which one do you pick? Because they will ask you, are you impacting this one, or this one? Which one is it that acoustics does? Well, acoustics does everything. You know that. But they have a really hard problem in the many-to-many relationship. They really like one-to-one relationships, right? So it's quite a hard sell to get them to understand, no, you need to add up all of these billion-dollar markets to have a really large market. So that's a challenge, okay? It shows your breadth of impact, but gives your message a complexity. I said at the beginning that the numbers, 4.6 billion, refer to the direct impact of acoustics. It's also important to think that the wider impact is much greater. So, acoustics goes into a whole bunch of different markets. We picked 10, we could probably pick more, okay? And within those, the value of acoustics in these is enormous. A submarine that makes noise is not particularly stealthy, right? A building where you can hear your neighbors doing the washing up is not particularly nice to live in, right? These are the things you guys are experts on. So your leverage is very significant. And the key thing is modest amounts of acoustic spend, it's the same in photonics, have an impact in billions. The leverage is very enormous. And so great things done by a series of small things brought together are very significant, right? That's something to emphasize always, right? Don't just get fixated on, well, we've quantified the impact. The impact is on our 4.6 billion industry. The impact is much bigger than that. The direct economic numbers are 4.6 billion. And the reason that contrast is important is the government gets concerned about direct impact because it's measurable. They recognize this is leverage, which is almost immeasurable, right? Since everything has a piece of acoustics in it, or light, the direct leveraged impact of acoustics is the entire economy. So you can rapidly tie yourself in knots if you start talking about leverage, because it's very hard to find something that does not have any acoustics in it. Right? So you've got to be careful about this, but certainly emphasize that wider impact. So is this as a winning formula? We've said we have impact in the industry strategy challenge areas. We've said we have a good UK knowledge base distributed around the UK. We've said we've got good global markets. It's timely for impact because these are growing markets. And we have UK capacity because there is an industry. You are the industry. So great. But those of you who have done any sales training here will realize those are just the qualifiers. They are not the order winners, right? They just get you in the game. They don't get you over the line. They don't get you at the front of the queue, unfortunately. And the front of the queue is slightly harder to get to for a number of reasons. One, this need for short-term impact, especially in the industrial strategy challenge fund areas, gives a problem. Because if I'm innovating at the system level, and I need to have impact in less than most people's product development cycle, all I can do is buy components that already exist. I do not have time to innovate new sub-elements. Now, if we are enabling technologies, that means what happens is there's no enabling technology innovation. People just buy stuff off the shelf, right, because it exists. That is a real danger, because I contend if I can construct a system from parts that already exist, just put them in a bucket, anybody can put those parts in a bucket. They're accessible to everybody. There is no barrier to entry to replicating that by other countries and other places in the world. To build real barriers to entry, you need innovation in the enabling technologies. But that gets squeezed out if you have short timescales. Right? So that's a challenge. How can we make sure enough funding triples down from these short-term impact challenges into enabling technology, into acoustics, to make sure that next generation things that enable you to really differentiate get supported and get developed and integrated. And these challenge guys don't just say, sorry, I don't have time for that, I just need something that already exists. Right. This problem is made worse by the word that I've managed to avoid using for at least 40 minutes, Brexit. So the best analogy I've found in this context for Brexit is with some American friends I was talking to recently. It's like a government shutdown. They're used to government shutdowns in America, right? What government shutdowns in America do is they stop federal spending totally. Everything gets backed up for political reasons, and nothing happens. It's like funding treacle. In the mechanisms and the integral details of actually day-to-day operation, all that means is things get delayed and starting times get delayed. Finishing times don't change. So what that means is as we see more Brexit shenanigans, and I'm going to ignore entirely the politics of that, what that does is it just delays the start. The end point, when people would like to see impact, hasn't moved. But your time just got shrunk, right? What does that mean to enabling technology? Well, that means that project time has just been squeezed even more. But it means you can do something to get prepared for that, is to say, well, it's likely the funding, it's likely these projects will carry on and will happen. When they might happen is slightly uncertain. But let's make sure we have the proposals in our back pockets. We have the components ready to deliver to these people in advance because they will want impact very quickly and they won't have time. So they'll want people to go to them and say, it's all right, we know this is a problem, we've done this, we think we're ready to do this. If we can have this money, we can make an impact here and we can help you out. So that's compression of timescales. Of course, if you mention the B word, you also have to beware of change. Governments change, politicians change. Actually, in this context, what that means is the buzzwords change, right? What I would say on buzzwords is, who's heard of missions? We've had challenges, grand challenges. In the next 12 months, look out for missions. They will appear everywhere. Right? Don't ask me why. But actually, the fundamentals are consistent. If you have an aging population and you have a smaller number of people to support a higher number of retired people in a population, productivity is your only way out. So productivity, getting more GVA per head, is the answer to lots of these problems. So the fundamentals of what makes good industrial policy, encouraging productivity, encouraging the integration of next generation innovation in acoustics as quickly as possible, does not change. Right? That remains constant. Just beware the buzzwords may change, right? The colors on the leaflets may change. Don't worry about that. Adapt, right? Don't get hung up on something that was policy last week. Just change the buzzwords, right? Is this process done? No. Request for help here to continue to help influence the future of acoustics in the UK. There is a survey on my magic friends, Kirill and Charlotte, have a magic little survey at that URL, which there are lots of little flyers on out there in the foyer, and they would love your input. Input into help expand these numbers so that we can gather more information on acoustics activity in the UK, so that list of companies is as big as possible. Input onto the decision makers that need to get a copy of this report, and that's really important, right? This is only as good as the people who read it. I'm very pleased to say when I produced this one, the guys in Bay said, can I have 25 copies? I need them to go on certain desks inside Bays immediately. They still read paper. I'm astonished. It's terrible, right? But those recommendations of who needs to see a copy of this and why, Charlotte to Kirill, and they will make sure they get them and are informed, and input onto where acoustics is going will be really gratefully received. So to summarize, acoustics is significant. 4.6 billion is nothing to be sneered at. The UK has the skills, the knowledge base, it has the industry, has that base from which to work. It's a big and growing global market, and it has significant leverage that will impact all the grand challenges. The future, yes, more evidence, as we said, of impact, updating these, and yes, it's important to update these. I'm working on the update to this one right now, and when it comes for update time, input to that expert panel, and these numbers are only as good as the input of the experts. It's very gratefully received. Who needs to see the report? Make sure that awareness is there. It's important. Those are my credentials, and many thanks to Richard Graston and Kirill, who really drove this, and Charlotte for helping coordinate everything and keep me on track. And I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.